Hi, and welcome to this live reading from A Mountain in the Air, a Trilogy by Laura Koerber, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Book 1, Coyote's Road Trip, Prologue. Most of the humans who pass through the Valley of Dry Bones have their eyes on the horizon and see very little of the desert outside the windows of their cars. Bored, they count off the miles left to get somewhere else. They calculate speed to distance, estimate their ETA, and grind out the hours of white line fever by fiddling with the car radio, tossing cigarettes out the window, eating junk food, or yelling at the kids in the back seat. 4 hours to Reno, 3 to Salt Lake City, an hour to Ellie. They have no desire to be where they are. They want, often very badly, to be somewhere else. A long time ago, Coyote saw some strange people passing through the valley in a wagon train. They had their eyes on the horizon and dreamed of California, but they figured distance in terms of footsteps and diminishing water while calculating how long their cattle were going to hold out. They wanted very, very badly to be somewhere else. Coyote was not in the habit of watching humans die, but he was present when old man Hardcoop finally gave up and lay down in the dirt in the meager shade of a sagebrush bush. The old man had been a passenger on the wagon of the Keseberg family, Mr. Keseberg being the guy who later became notorious for eating Tams and Donner. Mr. Keseberg had to lighten the load for his half-starved oxen. He'd already tossed furniture overboard, and he and his wife were afoot carrying their young daughter. He told old man Hardcoop to get out of the wagon and walk, knowing that the old man wouldn't be able to keep up. All of the settlers in the wagon train knew that old man Hardcoop wouldn't be able to keep up. They didn't discuss it, at least not while Coyote was in earshot, tracking their progress through his territory. They just trudged onward, eyes on the distant mountains, dreaming with increasing desperation of California. To them, the desert was an obstacle, a dreadful passage, a trial that tested their moral and physical strength. They saw nothing in the desert to sustain their lives. The sustenance was there. After all, the people had been living in the desert for generations. Their ancestors had wandered into the Valley of Dry Bones hundreds of years previously. They'd looked around and learned what they needed to learn and found what they needed to find. In the landscape of soft grays and beige, delicate pinks and vivid greens, of thorns and insects, of drought and torrential rain, they found rice grass and jackrabbits. They found springs of fresh water in a river. They found pinyon nuts on the slopes of the mountain, reeds in the marshes, and antelope out in the sagebrush. In other words, they found the necessities of life: food, water, shelter, beauty. The valley's name came from the tendency of dead animals to hang around forever as white bones cleaned by the vultures and insects and scoured by wind-blown sand. Strewn on the ground were the tiny bones of mice and the slightly more robust bones of rabbits. Coyote often stepped on bones of hawks and antelope as he patrolled his territory. Once he found the bones of a desert tortoise rattling like castanets in the shell. He'd seen bones of snakes, bones of people, and bones of his brother and sister coyotes. All those bones were constant reminders of how everyone's story ended, like the tangy taste of dried ants, death-flavored life. The valley is a wide, flat plain between sudden mountains that climb up abruptly, not bothering with foothills, straight to the sky. Often hazy from the hot, dry air, washed out by the glare of the sun, or obscured by thunderheads, the mountains are like a distant dream. The best time for you to see the mountains, dear reader, is on an overcast day when the sky is a dark, cloudy blue. Then your eyes can see across 50 or so miles of flat land to where the pinyon forests cover the mountain slopes with a soothing patchwork of dark green. The bones of the mountain are easy to see on those days. Steep slants cut by ravines. The forces of erosion have been in action since long before Coyote came into being, and certainly before you, dear reader, were born. The mountains are another way that death spies the lives of the living. All you have to do is look at the rocks and ravines to know that life is short. Coyote didn't pay much mind to the people who lived in his valley. They lived by their accumulated years of experience and weren't in need of his magic, nor did he need much from them. They coexisted side by side, foraging and feeding, procreating and dying. Coyote didn't pay much attention to their deaths either. He knew that individual humans lived and died, just as the animals and plants lived and died, but the web of life in the desert remained constant. Old man Hardcoop's death was intriguing to Coyote because the wagon train people had turned their backs on one of their own. The people of the desert were never indifferent to the suffering of one of their own. They moved seasonally, but they carried those who needed to be carried as best they could. If they were starving, which happened every now and then, and they couldn't carry someone with them, they mourned those they couldn't save. Coyote was baffled by the ways of the new people. They seemed to be stupid, incompetent, and cruel. Old Man Hardcoop didn't die right away. He tried to keep up. His feet were swollen and bleeding, and his boots were worn down to rags. The wagons, wearily dragged along by thin, thirsty oxen, didn't move fast, and neither did the thin, thirsty women or the dusty, frightened children. Everyone shuffled and stumbled. Mrs. Kiesberg held on the side of the wagon to keep herself on her feet. No one spoke except to yell. Mostly they yelled at the oxen, but sometimes they exploded at each other with voices raw and ragged from the dust. When not yelling, they trudged in silence. Old Man Hardcoop didn't ask for help. He staggered on, first only 20 feet behind the Kiesberg wagon, then 40 feet, then behind so far that he couldn't see the wagons anymore, just the dust. Coyote tracked him from the brush nearby. He watched the bony shoulders and limp, dusty hat, the swollen hands dangling, the tear tracks on the dirty cheeks. The old man's eyes weren't on the horizon, and any dreams of California were dead. His steps slowed. His head bobbled at the end of his skinny neck. He was wondering which step would be his last one when his knees gave out. Coyote watched the old man collapse into a heap on the ground. There he slumped, his head dangling on his neck, his gnarly old hands laying in his lap. Maybe he thought about the home of his birth in Belgium, or maybe he remembered his farm in Ohio. His wife, God bless her, was in her grave. He had dreamed of California, but he knew he would never travel any farther than a sagebrush bush in the desert of Nevada. Coyote watched the old man wipe the sweat off his face and look around one last time. Old Man Hardcoop couldn't see any way to sustain life. So slowly, gently, he lowered his shoulder and his head so that he was laying on his side. Then he covered his face with one of his thin, spidery hands. Coyote trotted away. It was all very confusing. For millennia, only the people had lived in the desert. Now these new people were passing through, and they didn't know anything, didn't seem to want to learn anything, and they didn't take care of their own. He didn't like them.